Hundreds, literally hundreds of formerly homeless people in Los Angeles were evicted from their apartments after a nonprofit that helped house them in the first place failed to pay the rent on time. This story is insane, and it gives you a sense of how much money is wasted and how much dysfunction we are experiencing in local government here in Los Angeles. I'm sure that this model has been replicated in other parts of the country as well, but this is something that has cost a lot of money and in the end has not yielded the results that people would expect and that homeless people should expect as individuals who deserve dignity, who deserve a place to live without these incredibly disruptive situations coming about because of the incredibly irresponsible nature of these nonprofits. So altogether, 306 people lost taxpayer-funded homes in South Los Angeles as a result of Hopics's failure to pay rent on time, the nonprofit said. While more than half were then placed in permanent housing or sent to temporary sites, Hopics and Los Angeles housing authorities did not say what happened to the other 119 people. So at the heart of this is that nonprofit known as Hopics. Now, I'm gonna keep calling it Hopics, but for the sake of knowing its full name, it's the Homeless Outreach Program Integrated Care System. And former disgraced Congresswoman Katie Hill has an executive role with this nonprofit, which I thought was fascinating. We're gonna hear a statement from her in just a second. But one of the evicted tenants told the press the following: "It's about time somebody stepped up and exposed what Hopics is doing," said Demario Swate, a 59-year-old who was evicted. "The nonprofit gets a grant to make sure that people are housed and people are not being housed, and I'm one of them." Now, Cal Matters, a publication here in California, obviously interviewed 3 of the participants who landlords said were evicted from Hopics funded houses, and they reported ending up back on the streets or living in their cars. And according to an investigation done by Cal Matters, the prominent, very prominent, once you look into how much funding they've received, Los Angeles nonprofit has repeatedly ignored explicit eviction warnings from their landlords, did little to vet middlemen that it entrusted to execute the program. So like, not only are these nonprofits serving as like middlemen themselves, they then contract middlemen. There are middlemen to the middlemen. Like, that's how like crazy and bureaucratic the system is, when in reality you should have a government agency that's well-staffed and well-resourced to handle a situation as devastating and as disgraceful as the homelessness crisis here in Los Angeles and in California. Also, they took on far more clients than the case managers could serve. They were only supposed to have, about 20 clients, and this nonprofit had high turnover and they were understaffed. And so the staff would take on far too many clients. And when you do that, unfortunately, you're not going to be able to provide adequate service to these individuals. And so what does Hopics do? Like, what is their mission? Well, they're supposed to help unhoused people find a place to live. What they do is they will pay a portion of the rent, subsidize a portion of the rent for up to 2 years. And also they're supposed to provide social services like employment training and assistance applying for public benefits. The idea is to kind of get people on their own 2 feet and give them an opportunity to grow and progress to a point where they are independent, they can take care of themselves. Ideally, the clients gradually contribute more to their rent until they're able to stay housed on their own. And I think that's a great idea. And I think the social services that are attached to this, I mean, theoretically, if it was actually working, is a great idea. But it seems as though there was a lot of mismanagement here. So landlords are often, and I hate that this is true, but it is true. Landlords are often reluctant to rent their properties to people receiving government rental assistance, whether due to bias against them or just aversion to some of the red tape that comes along with tenants who are subsidized by local government. So instead, what Hopics would do is they would turn to these middlemen and they would call them brokers, right? And the brokers would then rent the properties and then sublease the rooms in those properties to the participants, to the clients. Norris Jones created the nonprofit Housing One by One in August of 2020, for instance, to help with Los Angeles's housing and homelessness crisis, he said. A month later, he welcomed his first Hopics tenant. Jones and his partner, Dejon Dixon, sublet more than a dozen units, housing more than 80 people for about $950 a month for a private room. They charged $2,800 as a security deposit, according to several signed lease agreements. Now, things unfortunately devolved from there. Jones rents units from Ocean Properties on behalf of the clients that are being served by Hopics. Jones and 3 other brokers said Hopics would go months without paying rent, causing them to fall behind on paying the property owners. As a result, he says he owes Ocean Properties more than $200,000 in rent and fees. Can you imagine? You're like relying on this for-profit to reimburse you and ensure that you're paying the rent to the landlords that you are renting from on behalf of these clients, and he can't get them to do what they're supposed to do and pay him. And so Hopics officials say that Jones has overstated how much it owes him, and in some cases said he submitted invoices far too late to get reimbursed. That's not a thing. Let's be clear about that. There's no, oh, you sent in the invoice a little too late, so now we're not gonna reimburse you. That's not a thing. You have to pay people. You can't just say, I don't even believe it, right? But even if it's true that he took his time to send the invoices in, you gotta pay the man, okay? Especially when you're receiving hundreds of millions of dollars from the city. Anyway, but still in a February email to Jones, Hopics acknowledged owing him $135,000 for 2022 and upwards of $90,000 for 2023. So in other words, he was right. They absolutely do owe him, around $200,000 for the work that he's done for them. And Hopics, there's also evidence that Hopics failed to do the proper vetting of some of the middlemen brokers that the nonprofit contracted to work with. For instance, it acknowledged that it went into business with some brokers without doing so much as a Google search. For instance, the agency leased 24 locations from Danye Mitchell of L.A. Supportive Housing. Cal Matters found that Mitchell left federal prison in 2014 after serving a sentence for defrauding California's Employment Development Department. Like, what you guys need to understand is that when it comes to government grants, there are people looking for a quick payday, all right? And so you have these nonprofits sprout up during the coronavirus pandemic because you see all this legislation passing that grants a lot more money to government to ensure that they're housing people who are on the streets during the pandemic to try to keep people safe. And some see that as a great opportunity to improve people's lives. Others see it as an opportunity to get rich quick. And so get a load of Katie Hill, a former United States Congresswoman who was ousted from Congress because of her inappropriate relationship with staffers. We didn't have the habit of Google searching everybody's names. And probably that's a simple fix, said Hopics Deputy Director and former US Representative Katie Hill. Unbelievable. In other words, she is admitting that the simple vetting didn't happen before hiring some of these middlemen. Hopics, which has received about $140 million in Los Angeles City, county, state, and federal funding over the last 3 years for a program known as rapid rehousing, was months behind on paying rent. And it's rent for the tenant that we heard from a little earlier who was like, I'm glad that someone's reporting on Hopics because they need to be exposed for what they're doing. And look, the homelessness crisis in California is different from any other state because oftentimes when there are issues, it's because local government isn't allocating the necessary resources to adequately respond to the crisis. That's not the case in California. So for instance, Gavin Newsom's administration has allocated more than $20 billion to fight homelessness, but the state's homeless population has exploded to 170,000 people in 2020. 2022. I'm sure the numbers are even higher now. And by the way, we need to build housing. Like that's also a huge part of it. We need to have drug rehabilitation programs, not just harm reduction. Some people actually really want to get clean and they need to go through detox and rehabilitation. That's incredibly expensive and people can't afford it. That needs to be an expanded model. And due to COVID, the federal government also spent $100 million in emergency aid to Los Angeles County specifically to address homelessness during the pandemic, along with another $220 million to 6 cities in the region, including Los Angeles. And so revenues at special service for groups surged from $84 million in 2018 before the pandemic to $149.1 million in 2022. It also gets rapid rehousing funding from Measure H. That was something I voted in favor of in 2017, the Los Angeles County sales tax and a mix of federal, state, and city funds. Basically, Californians, Angelenos, so people in LA, through a ballot measure, voted to increase their own taxes so we could build housing and house people because we see what's happening to our fellow Americans on the streets. And where's that money going? Obviously, they're not building the housing necessary to respond to this adequately. And when the money gets funneled to some of these nonprofits, and those nonprofits aren't being held accountable, there isn't enough government oversight, a lot of that money ends up getting wasted. And so there's also this nonprofit model situation where it appears that corruption might be taking place. For instance, Hopics director Veronica Lewis was paid $261,000 last year, according to the organization's tax records. But get a load of this. She also sits on the state council on homelessness, which Governor Newsom has charged with developing policies to prevent and end homelessness in California. Do you guys see the conflict of interest there? Because if you're collecting a $261,000 salary every year and it's to respond to the homeless crisis, are you really gonna have a vested interest in solving the problem that's getting you paid? I just think that this model has all sorts of issues, obviously mismanagement of funds, but also there's a corrupt element to it as well. And perhaps some of that money should be used, to actually hire more caseworkers at Hopics. Instead of paying her, $261,000, they're understaffed. And being understaffed leads to inadequate care for the clients that they're trying to serve. One employee said that the agency was badly understaffed because of high turnover and unable to keep up with the number of tenants that it was supposed to serve. And Los Angeles County requires each case manager to work with up to 25 clients, but in some cases they're dealing with 30, 35 clients. When I signed my acceptance letter, it was for 20 clients, and within 30 days, I had 60, said Neil Glasgow, a former caseworker for Hopics, who said he left in 2022 after about a year. I was playing catch up every month. So in response to this reporting and in response to this investigation, the leaders over at Hopics are now saying, we need to reconsider hiring middlemen who rent units on our behalf. We'll see how that plays out. And they're also claiming that maybe they'll consider doing Google searches here and there when it comes to vetting people that they decide to work with. But I think this entire model is broken. I think that it would make far more sense to have a robust local government agency that directly provides the services, and those services need to go beyond simply putting someone in temporary housing. There is a very real mental health crisis. There's a very real drug addiction problem. Those issues need to be dealt with as well. And right now I'm seeing very little of that on the ground here in LA. I'm sure that's the case in other places across the country as well.
Hey, thanks for watching that video. We really appreciate it, guys. And we appreciate it if you become members, because that allows us to be independent, honest, progressive, all the things that you don't get from corporate media. And all of that is because of you guys. Hit the join button below and become one of us, become a Young Turk.